The Verrin scout vessel Quiet Inquiry had been built for exactly one purpose, and Commander Yesh-Torrel had performed that purpose 41 times across a career that had made her, within certain circles of Verrin military intelligence, something of a legend, though not the kind of legend anyone put on recruitment materials. The purpose was simple, in the way that very old, very effective doctrines tended to be simple. Before the Verrin Compact committed any serious diplomatic or military resource to a newly discovered species, a scout vessel was sent to conduct what the mission briefings called, with the bloodless precision of institutional language designed to obscure exactly how uncomfortable the underlying activity actually was, a resolve assessment. The scout would locate an isolated, minimally defended outpost belonging to the target species and provoke it, carefully, incrementally, escalating just enough to force a response, without ever crossing the threshold into an engagement serious enough to constitute an actual act of war. The outpost's reaction, whether it folded quickly under pressure, whether it fought back with more capability than expected, whether its command structure fractured or held, all of it was data, and the data, compiled across 41 prior assessments spanning 6 previously uncontacted species, had never once failed to accurately predict how that species would behave in a full-scale engagement years later. It was not a policy Yesh-Torrel enjoyed. She had said as much, on record, in exactly one debrief early in her career, and had been quietly informed afterward, by a superior officer she still respected, that enjoying it was never the point, and that the alternative, committing the full weight of Verrin diplomatic and military resources to a species without any real understanding of what that species would do under pressure, had a body count, across the Compact's older history, considerably higher than the Resolve assessment program had ever produced. She had accepted the reasoning. She had continued performing the assessments. She had gotten, over 22 years, extremely good at calibrating exactly how much pressure a given species could absorb before the picture became clear, and exactly how to withdraw cleanly once it had. The human outpost designated Kessler Waypoint, according to 6 months of quiet Verrin reconnaissance, was, by every available metric, close to the weakest possible target the doctrine could ask for: a research and relay station, minimal defensive armament, barely more than what the doctrine's own threshold guidelines classified as civilian grade. A crew complement under 30. No history, in the reconnaissance data, of any prior contact with a hostile power more advanced than whatever conflicts the species had fought exclusively among itself, conflicts the Compact's own intelligence assessment had described. With the particular condescension of an institution reviewing a species' internal history from a comfortable technological distance, as primitive, disorganized, and unlikely to have produced meaningful strategic doctrine transferable to a contact scenario this far outside anything the species had previously experienced. A clean assessment, Yesh-Torrel's tactical officer, Van Ossa, had said during the mission briefing, with the particular confidence of a younger officer who had run only 6 prior assessments and had not yet learned, the way Yesh-Torrel privately had, that clean was a word the doctrine liked to use and reality rarely honored. Minimal risk profile. I would estimate full resolve collapse within the first pressure escalation, based on the outpost's defensive capability alone. Yesh-Torrel had reviewed the same reconnaissance data and found herself less certain, for reasons she could not entirely articulate to her own satisfaction, and had eventually attributed the unease to 22 years of accumulated caution rather than anything specific in the numbers, a judgment she would later reflect on, at some length, as one of the more embarrassing miscalibrations of her career, though not for the reasons the doctrine had ever prepared her to expect. The Quiet Inquiry approached the Kessler Waypoint under standard low-profile protocol, running just bright enough to be detected by the outpost's sensor suite, deliberately avoiding full stealth, because the doctrine specified that a resolve assessment required the target to know it was being watched by something it could not immediately identify, the ambiguity itself being according to 4 centuries of Verrin doctrine, the first and most reliable pressure point available. The Quiet Inquiry's own systems included what Verrin engineering considered a fairly sophisticated linguistic and cultural interface module, designated internally as Locus, built to process intercepted communications from a target species and flag, in real time, anything indicating hostile intent, panic, or capitulation, feeding a continuous resolve index back to the command deck that Yesh-Torrel had learned, over 22 years, to trust with slightly more confidence than she trusted most of her junior officers, largely because Locus, unlike her junior officers, had never once let institutional optimism color its threat assessments. This confidence would prove to be, in the specific and unprecedented case of the Kessler Waypoint, a serious miscalculation, though the fault, as an exhaustive post-incident review would eventually determine at considerable length, lay not with Locus's underlying architecture, but with the training data it had been built on. 6 months of intercepted human communications, gathered exclusively from formal channels, official transmissions, technical documentation, and diplomatic correspondence, a data set that had given Locus a perfectly serviceable grasp of human grammar and vocabulary, and an almost complete absence of exposure to the specific, dense, load-bearing category of human speech known, in the species' own linguistic tradition, as the idiom. The first escalation was modest, by design. The Quiet Inquiry allowed itself to be detected clearly, holding position at a distance calculated to register as deliberate rather than accidental, and transmitted a short, ambiguous burst of encoded signal. Not a message exactly, more a controlled demonstration of capability, the kind of thing 4 centuries of doctrine described as establishing presence without yet requiring response. Petty Officer Reyes, who had drawn overnight comms duty again, this time roughly 7 months after the whale song incident that had, by this point, become something of a station legend that new arrivals were told about within their first week specifically so they would understand exactly what kind of place they had been posted to, logged the unidentified signal, flagged it as non-hostile in profile but unknown in origin, and per standing protocol established in the aftermath of the earlier contact, escalated it directly to Commander Okonkwo rather than attempting to interpret it herself. "Unknown contact," Okonkwo said, reviewing the signal profile in the relay room with the particular weary alertness of someone who had, over the preceding months, developed a healthy and specific caution around unidentified transmissions, non-hostile profile, no request for response. "What's our read?" "Could be another greeting," Reyes offered, with the faint, hopeful optimism of someone who had personally been vindicated once already this year. "Could also just be somebody saying hi from a distance, working up the nerve." "Or," Okonkwo said, "it's a completely different situation, and we shouldn't assume every unidentified signal that shows up out here wants to be our friend just because the last one did. Hold position, monitor, don't transmit anything back yet. Let's see what they actually want before we start composing our next accidental diplomatic masterpiece." The Quiet Inquiry, receiving no response after a calculated interval, escalated according to doctrine, moving to a closer orbital position, well within range, to be unambiguously visible to the outpost's own sensor suite, and transmitting a second signal, longer this time, carrying, embedded within an otherwise unremarkable structured data burst, a deliberately aggressive resonance pattern designed to register, to a species with no prior context for interpreting it, as unmistakably a demonstration of force rather than a greeting. It registered, this time, exactly as intended, and the outpost's response, when it finally came 20 minutes later, arrived not as a transmission, but as a full defensive posture shift, weapons systems, modest as they were, brought online, and a terse, formal hail broadcast on an open frequency, translated by Locus in real time for the benefit of the Quiet Inquiry's command deck. "This is Kessler Relay Station to unidentified vessel," the translated transcript read, rendered by Locus in the flat, literal register the system defaulted to whenever it encountered a phrase it could parse grammatically, but had insufficient contextual data to fully interpret. State your intentions immediately, or we will be forced to respond in kind. Van Ossa, watching the resolve index tick upward on the tactical display, allowed himself a note of satisfaction. There it is. Defensive posture, formal warning, exactly within the range the doctrine predicts for a species with limited prior contact experience. I expect capitulation within the next 2 escalations, Commander. This is tracking almost precisely to the standard curve. Yesh-Torrel, watching the same display, found her earlier unease sharpening rather than dissolving, though she could not yet say why, and gave the order for the 3rd escalation regardless, because the doctrine, whatever her private instincts said, had a 41 assessment track record she had no principled basis to override on the strength of a feeling she could not articulate. The 3rd escalation was, by doctrine standard, a modest but unambiguous show of weapons readiness, close enough to communicate serious capability, calibrated carefully to fall short of anything that could plausibly be interpreted as an opening attack, a fine and deliberately uncomfortable line that 4 centuries of Verrin institutional experience had refined into something close to an art form. Kessler Waypoint's response arrived considerably faster this time, and it was here, in the specific translated wording of that response, that the entire resolve assessment began, quietly and then not quietly at all, to come apart. Unidentified vessel, the outpost transmitted, and locus, parsing the human speech pattern in real time, flagged the message with its highest available confidence rating for hostile intent. Before rendering the translation for the command deck, you are playing with fire. This station will not go down without a fight, and if you push us any further, you had better believe we will bring the house down with us. The command deck went very still. Playing with fire, Van Ossa repeated slowly, staring at the transcript. They are threatening to ignite a combustion event. Bring the house down, said a second officer, cross-referencing the phrase against the ship's limited archive of human structural terminology. Their command structure is threatening structural detonation of their own facility. A scorched earth response. Yesh-Torrel stared at the display and felt the specific, cold recalibration of 22 years of accumulated instinct suddenly finding, at last, a shape to attach itself to. Locus, she said. Confidence rating on this translation. 91% confidence on literal semantic content, the ship's system responded, in the flat neutral tone Locus used for every report, regardless of what it was reporting, flagging elevated hostile intent based on explicit threat of self-destruction as a retaliatory measure. Recommend immediate reassessment of target resolve profile. Prior classification of minimal risk is no longer supported by current data. They're threatening mutual annihilation, Van Ossa said, and Yesh-Torrel noted, with the particular grim satisfaction of an officer whose long-ignored instincts had finally been proven correct, that the younger officer's earlier confidence had entirely evaporated. A civilian research outpost with a crew of under 30, minimal defensive capability, no history of engagement with a power remotely approaching our own, is threatening to detonate its own facility rather than yield to a 4th escalation that has not yet even reached the threshold of an actual attack. Which means, Yesh-Torrel said slowly, working through the doctrine's own logic even as every part of her 22 years of experience began quietly screaming that something in this specific data set had gone catastrophically wrong somewhere upstream. Either this species has a threshold for acceptable loss that makes every other species we have ever assessed look cautious by comparison, or, and here she stopped, because the alternative was, in its own way, almost more unsettling than the first possibility, or something in our translation architecture is generating an interpretation this species never actually intended to convey. She ordered an immediate halt to further escalation over Van Ossa's initial, hesitant objection that the doctrine specified a minimum of 6 escalation stages before a resolve assessment could be considered conclusive, and pulled the full transcript archive, every translated human transmission gathered since first contact 7 months earlier, cross-referencing it against Locus's confidence ratings across the entire dataset, a review that took the better part of 6 hours and produced, by its conclusion, a picture considerably stranger and more specific than anything the doctrine's 41 prior assessments had prepared the Quiet Inquiry's command deck to interpret. "Commander," said the ship's junior linguistics analyst, a young officer named Descarn, who had been quietly, methodically working through the archive since the halt order came down, and who now approached Yesh-Torrel station with the particular careful energy of someone who believed she had found something important and was not yet certain how her superiors would receive it. "I believe I have identified the source of the discrepancy. May I show you?" Yesh-Torrel gestured her forward. "Locus's training archive," Descarn said, bringing up a comparative display, "was built almost entirely from formal human communication, technical documentation, diplomatic correspondence, official military transmission. This gave the system an extremely reliable grasp of literal human grammar and vocabulary. What it did not give the system was any meaningful exposure to a specific, and I want to stress, extremely dense, category of human speech that does not map to literal meaning at all. Humans call these idioms, fixed phrases whose actual communicative content bears little to no relationship to the literal meaning of the individual words involved. And Commander, the specific human dialect we have been monitoring at Kessler Waypoint appears to draw on this category of speech far more heavily than the formal channels our original training data was built from ever exposed us to, particularly in moments of stress, which is, I am given to understand from the cultural cross-reference files the diplomatic corps shared with us following the earlier whale incident, apparently a well-documented human pattern, informal and idiomatic speech becoming considerably more prevalent under pressure rather than less. She pulled up the specific transcript. "You are playing with fire. I have cross-referenced this phrase against an extensive archive of pre-contact human recorded media. It does not, in the overwhelming majority of documented usage, refer to actual combustion. It is a figurative warning, communicating that the listener is engaging in a course of action the speaker considers dangerously reckless, with no literal implication of fire whatsoever. And bring the house down," Yesh-Torrel said slowly. "Also figurative, Commander, and I confess this one required considerably more cross-referencing before I was confident in the interpretation, because the phrase carries multiple documented usages depending on context, some of them, remarkably, entirely positive, referring to an enthusiastically well-received performance. In this specific context, following directly after the fire idiom, I believe it was intended to communicate something closer to, if you continue this confrontation, we will resist with everything available to us and make the resulting engagement extremely difficult and costly for you. An expression of determined resolve, Commander, not a literal threat of structural self-destruction." Yesh-Torrel sat with this for a long moment, running the full recalibrated interpretation back through everything the resolve assessment had logged over the preceding hours, and found herself, for the first time in a 22-year career built on the careful, methodical application of doctrine, laughing, a short, disbelieving sound that drew several concerned glances from the rest of the command deck. "We nearly aborted an assessment," she said, "and quite possibly triggered an unnecessary escalation toward a species we have spent 7 months carefully cultivating a diplomatic relationship with, because our translation system interpreted a colloquial warning about recklessness as a formal declaration of intent to detonate their own station." "It is not an unreasonable error, Commander," Descarn said carefully. "The literal semantic content genuinely does describe exactly what Locus reported. The failure was not in the translation itself, but in the absence of sufficient cultural context to recognize when literal translation actively misrepresents intended meaning. I would recommend, going forward, a substantial expansion of Locus's training archive, specifically toward informal and idiomatic human speech, because based on what I am seeing in this transcript alone, Commander, I suspect this will not be the last time this exact category of error nearly derails an otherwise promising exchange. Yesh-Torrel gave the order to halt the resolve assessment entirely, a decision that would require considerable justification once the quiet inquiry returned to Verrin compact space, given that no prior assessment in the program's 4-century history had ever been aborted mid-sequence on the strength of a linguistic reinterpretation rather than a completed resolve curve. She composed the report herself that evening, sitting alone in her quarters, turning the day's events over with the particular unsettled fascination of an officer who had spent 22 years learning to read a species' behavior under pressure and had just discovered, in a single afternoon, that an entirely new species might require an entirely new kind of reading altogether. She did not, in the end, recommend resuming the assessment. She recommended instead, in a report that would eventually work its way up through several layers of increasingly skeptical Verrin command before being grudgingly accepted, that the doctrine itself required revision for any species whose communication patterns proved this dense with figurative, non-literal content, on the grounds that a resolve assessment built on systematically misread signals produced data that was, if anything, worse than no data at all, because it created the illusion of understanding precisely where the actual understanding was most dangerously absent. 7 weeks later, in a formal joint session between the Verrin Compact's diplomatic course and the Human Relay Authority, a session Yesh-Torrel had specifically requested to attend, despite it falling well outside her usual Scout Command responsibilities, because she had, by her own private admission to exactly one trusted colleague, developed something of a personal investment in understanding this particular species properly, before her career required her to assess another one. The full story finally reached Commander Okonkwo's side of the table, delivered with the same careful, faintly embarrassed formality Serene had once used to explain the whale incident. "I want to be direct about what occurred," said the Verrin diplomatic liaison, a senior official named Threll, who had clearly drawn the unenviable task of explaining, on behalf of an entire military doctrine, that the Compact had spent several tense hours seriously considering the possibility that a research station of 30 people intended to blow itself up rather than yield to a scouting probe. Approximately 7 weeks ago, a Verrin scout vessel conducted what our doctrine terms a resolve assessment near your Kessler outpost, a standard, if I will grant you uncomfortable procedure, intended to gather data on a new species' behavior under graduated pressure before our compact commits further diplomatic resource. Okonkwo's expression had already begun to shift towards something considerably less relaxed than the friendly formality the meeting had opened with. "You were testing us, provoking us on purpose to see how we'd react." "Yes," Threll said, without attempting to soften it, having apparently decided, correctly, that the diplomatic cost of an evasive explanation would exceed the cost of an uncomfortable honest one. "I want to be equally direct that the assessment was aborted, mid-sequence, an unprecedented action in 4 centuries of the program's history, because our translation system critically misread a specific category of your species' communication and generated an interpretation considerably more alarming than what your own personnel actually intended to convey." She laid it out, the escalations, the transcript, playing with fire, bring the house down, the 91% confidence rating Locus had assigned to a literal reading of threatened self-immolation, and the 6 hours of increasingly urgent archive review that had eventually revealed the far more mundane truth underneath. There was a considerable pause on the human side of the table, and then Reyes, who had once again been specifically invited to this session, this time explicitly because Okonkwo had, after the whale incident, developed a firm and permanent policy of including her in any meeting that seemed likely to involve translation difficulties, Given her apparently reliable instinct for exactly this category of problem, spoke into the silence with the particular delight of someone whose entire professional niche had just been officially validated for the second time in under a year. "Wait," Reyes said. "You almost started a diplomatic incident because your computer thought Chief Petrova was threatening to literally blow up the station over a turn of phrase? That appears to be an accurate summary, yes," Threlosa said. "That's okay. I need everyone to understand. That's an incredibly common thing for a person to say when they're stressed and mad. It doesn't mean anything. We say things like that constantly. My mom used to say she was going to kill me for tracking mud in the house, and I want it on the record she did not, in fact, kill me. Not even once. Not even close." Reyes was visibly working to contain a laugh that eventually escaped anyway. "You built a whole military assessment doctrine around watching how scared species get under pressure, and the first time you tried it on us, we talked like we always talk, and your computer heard, 'We would rather die than surrender,' when what Chief Petrova actually meant was closer to, 'Please stop, this is annoying and also a little concerning, cut it out.'" "I confess," Threlosa said, with the particular careful dignity of a diplomat determined to see an embarrassing admission through to its full, unflinching conclusion, that the discrepancy between those two readings has occupied a great deal of committee discussion over the past 7 weeks. Commander Okonkwo, who had spent the first several minutes of this revelation working through a fairly serious internal reassessment of exactly how close her station had come, without her own knowledge, to a genuinely dangerous escalation with a species whose military capability she still did not fully understand, allowed herself, finally, a slow exhale. "I need to be honest with you about how I'm receiving this," she said. "The idea that you deliberately provoked an isolated, minimally defended civilian outpost to test how we'd behave under threat, without our knowledge or consent, is not something I can just wave off because it turned out to be a translation error. That's a serious breach of trust, regardless of how the technical failure played out." "I understand," Threlosa said, and Yesh-Torrel, seated slightly apart from the main diplomatic delegation, spoke for the first time in the session, because she had, in fact, come specifically prepared to say this part herself. "Commander Okonkwo," she said, "I am the officer who commanded that scout vessel. I want you to know that I have, in the 7 weeks since, formally recommended the Resolve Assessment Doctrine be suspended entirely for further contact with your species, and revised substantially for any future species with communication patterns dense enough in figurative language to make the assessment's underlying premise that we can reliably read a species' true resolve through carefully calibrated pressure, unreliable at best. I have run this exact assessment 41 times, against 6 different species, across 22 years, and it has never once produced a reading I later discovered to be this dramatically, almost comically wrong. I do not say this to excuse what was done to your people without their knowledge. I say it because I want you to understand that whatever trust was damaged today, I do not intend to let this specific failure simply be filed away and forgotten. I have spent this career learning to read species accurately enough to protect my own people from committing resource to relationships that would eventually cost them dearly. I discovered, 7 weeks ago, that I had no reliable way to read yours at all, using any method my doctrine had ever given me, and I would like the chance, going forward, to learn a better one, properly, with your knowledge and your consent this time, rather than from outside your window with a probe and a translation system that apparently cannot tell the difference between a threat of mutual annihilation and Chief Petrova, by the sound of it, having an extremely normal bad day." There was a long pause, and then, unexpectedly, Okonkwo laughed, short and startled, some of the tension in her shoulders finally easing. "Chief Petrova is going to want to hear this exact story told back to her, word for word. I want you to know that. She's not going to let any of us live this down for a considerable while. I would be, in the interest of full transparency and continued honest exchange, Threlosa said, prepared to provide the complete transcript, translation errors included, for exactly that purpose. The revised doctrine, once it eventually completed its slow journey through several additional layers of Verrin institutional review over the following year, retained the underlying principle that new contact required some reliable method of understanding a species' behavior under pressure, but abandoned entirely the practice of unilateral, unconsented provocation as the mechanism for gathering it. Replaced instead by a considerably more collaborative framework built around joint stress scenario exercises, conducted openly, with full mutual consent and, crucially, an extensively expanded locus training archive, built this time from months of deliberately gathered informal human speech, gathered with permission, and reviewed, at Reyes's own semi-official insistence, by an advisory panel that came to include, alongside the Verrin linguistics staff, exactly one human petty officer whose specific documented talent for correctly anticipating exactly where and how translation was likely to go catastrophically wrong, had, by that point, become something the diplomatic corps on both sides had simply learned, with a mixture of professional respect and lingering amusement, not to question. Chief Petrova, when the full story finally reached her, some weeks later, by then thoroughly polished into its most entertaining possible station legend form by Reyes's enthusiastic retelling, reportedly received the news with considerably more good humor than the situation strictly warranted, and was heard, on more than one subsequent occasion, to remark, whenever some new piece of alien technology or protocol proved unexpectedly finicky, that she supposed she would simply have to be more careful, going forward, about exactly how much fire she claimed to be playing with.